For 6 years, veteran Elias Thorne was a ghost, a man living without emotion. But after a grim diagnosis for his old dog, Ghost, something inside him broke. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He did something far stranger. He withdrew his last savings, and with a pen in hand he wrote a list. It wasn't a list of supplies or coordinates. It was a list of simple joys. A steak dinner, a walk with no leash, a squeaky toy. This was not an escape. This was a final mission. A race against time to fulfill a promise that death itself was threatening to break. He was about to take his only friend to the place he had sworn never to return to. All to complete a list for a hero who was about to depart. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The silence in the apartment was a living thing. It had weight and texture, woven from the hum of an old refrigerator and the faint, distant drone of city traffic. For Elias, it was the sound of his life. He moved through the sparse rooms with an economy of motion learned in another world, a place of noise and urgency that now felt like a half-forgotten dream. Here, in this empty space, his life was a series of quiet, mechanical rituals that marked the passing of days he no longer bothered to count. He existed on a small disability pension, enough to cover the rent on this minimalist apartment and the simple necessities it took to keep a man and a dog alive. The walls were bare, the color of bone. There was a mattress on the floor in one room, a single armchair, and a small table in the other. There were no photographs, no books, no decorations. It was not a home. It was a holding cell, a place to wait for nothing in particular. Elias himself looked like a man carved from hardship. He was in his early 40s, with the lean, hard frame of someone whose body had been pushed to its limits and beyond. His dark hair was cut short, a habit he'd never broken, and threaded with silver at the temples. His face was all sharp angles and weathered lines, the kind of face that kept its secrets well. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were a deep, stormy gray, and they held the profound, weary stillness of a man who had seen too much. They looked out at the world without really seeing it, haunted by ghosts that no one else could perceive. His only companion in the silence was Ghost. The dog was a magnificent 12-year-old German shepherd, a living monument to a past that was both a source of pride and unbearable pain. His thick, sable coat, once the color of rich earth and dark shadows, was now frosted with gray around his noble muzzle and deep, intelligent eyes. He had the proud, regal bearing of an animal that knew its purpose, but his movements were stiff, his magnificent body betrayed by the slow creep of age. A pronounced limp in his right hind leg was a constant reminder that even the strongest soldiers eventually wore down. Ghost had been a military working dog, a partner, a warrior. Now he was simply an old dog, living out his final years in the quiet company of his handler. Their bond was forged in the crucible of war, a connection that ran deeper than words. They communicated in a language of their own, a shared glance, the subtle shift of weight, the soft thump of a tail against the floorboards. Ghost was the only living creature that Elias allowed to see past the empty facade. The dog was his anchor, his last link to the man he used to be. This morning, the ritual was broken. As Elias set down Ghost's food bowl, the old dog took a few eager steps forward, then faltered. His hind leg buckled, and he stumbled, catching himself with a low whine that was more surprise than pain. He looked up at Elias, his amber eyes clouded with a moment of confusion. Elias froze. He watched as Ghost righted himself and began to eat, but the mechanical calm that usually insulated him was shattered. The stumble was new. It was a clear, undeniable sign that the slow decline was accelerating. The silence in the apartment suddenly felt heavier, charged with a new and terrible urgency. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his gut, that he could not ignore it any longer. An hour later, they were in the sterile, quiet waiting room of a veterinary clinic. Ghost lay patiently at Elias's feet, his head resting on his paws, his gaze fixed on the door as if he were on watch. Elias sat perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He looked like a statue of a soldier, unbreakable and stoic. Elias Thorne? A man in his late 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle, reassuring voice stood in the doorway. He was Dr. Miller, the clinic's veterinarian. Inside the examination room, Elias lifted Ghost onto the cold steel table with a practiced ease that spoke of years of handling. He stood beside his dog, one hand resting steadily on Ghost's back, a silent, comforting presence. Dr. Miller worked with a quiet competence, his hands moving over the old dog's body, checking his joints, listening to his heart. He was gentle, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to Ghost. As he worked, his gaze occasionally flickered to Elias. He saw the faded tattoo on the man's forearm, an intricate design of an angel with spread wings, the insignia of an Air Force pararescueman. He saw the way the man stood, poised and watchful, and he saw the profound, unspoken connection between the silent, grieving man and his aging dog. After the physical exam, Dr. Miller took some x-rays. The wait was the hardest part. Elias and Ghost were left alone in the room, the silence broken only by the rhythmic click of Ghost's nails on the linoleum floor as he shifted his weight. Elias stroked Ghost's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur, the simple, repetitive motion the only outlet for the tension coiling inside him. When Dr. Miller returned, the kindness in his eyes was overshadowed by a deep and unmistakable sadness. He put the X-ray films up on the lightbox without a word. The images were stark and clear. A large, aggressive mass was visible on Ghost's spleen, with smaller, insidious shadows scattered across his lungs. "It's cancer," Dr. Miller said, his voice soft but direct. "Hemangiosarcoma. It's very aggressive, and it has already spread. I'm so sorry, Elias. It's terminal." The words hung in the sterile air, each one a hammer blow against the fragile peace Elias had constructed for himself. He did not flinch. He did not speak. His expression remained a stoic mask, but a muscle ticked in his jaw. His gaze drifted from the X-rays to his dog, who looked back at him with unwavering trust. The world outside the small room seemed to fall away, leaving only the hum of the lightbox and the heavy, ragged sound of his own breathing. Dr. Miller gave him a few moments of silence before continuing. "We can talk about options to make him comfortable, pain management to ensure his quality of life for whatever time he has left. But you need to be prepared. It could be a few months, or it could be a matter of weeks." Elias finally nodded, a single, curt movement. He couldn't form the words to reply. The ghosts of the past, the ones he lived with every day, suddenly felt very close. They were whispering to him, reminding him of every loss, every failure, every person he couldn't save. As he prepared to leave, helping Ghost carefully off the table, Dr. Miller stopped him. The vet pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote a number on the back of a business card. "Look," he said, his voice low and sincere. He glanced at the tattoo on Elias's arm. "This dog is a hero. You both are. When the time comes, when it's his last day, and you don't want it to be in a place like this, you call this number. It's my personal cell. If I can, I'll try to come to you." Elias took the card, his fingers closing around the small piece of paper. He met the veterinarian's gaze and, for the first time, a flicker of something raw and human broke through the emptiness in his eyes. It was a look of profound, silent gratitude. He gave another single nod, unable to trust his voice. Then, he and his dog walked out of the clinic, leaving the world of medicine and bad news behind, stepping back into a silence that was now filled with the unbearable weight of a final countdown. The ride home from the clinic was a silent, suffocating journey. The small piece of cardstock with Dr. Miller's number on it felt as heavy as a tombstone in Elias's pocket. Back in the apartment, the oppressive silence he had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a shroud. He unclipped Ghost's leash, and the old dog moved to his usual spot on the cool floorboards, letting out a heavy sigh as he settled. He watched Elias with knowing, patient eyes. Elias did not eat. He did not turn on a light. He simply sank into the worn armchair as the afternoon sun bled out of the sky, replaced by the bruised purple of twilight and then the deep, impersonal black of night. The city outside came alive with a million pinpricks of light, a universe of lives being lived. But inside the apartment, there was only darkness. He sat for hours, a man turned to stone, the vet's words echoing in the vast, empty chambers of his mind. Weeks, months if you're lucky. Terminal. Grief was a familiar country, a landscape he had inhabited for 6 long years, ever since the rainy autumn of 2019. But this was different. The grief he knew was a chronic, low-grade ache for a past that was gone forever. This new grief was acute, a ticking clock, a countdown to a loss that was still to come. It was the sharp, terrible agony of impending absence. Sometime after midnight, propelled by an impulse he didn't understand, he rose from the chair. His movements were stiff, his joints aching from hours of immobility. He walked to the bedroom closet, the only place in the apartment that held anything more than the bare essentials. At the very bottom, beneath a spare blanket, was a simple wooden box, its surface filmed with a fine layer of dust. He lifted it, its weight both familiar and strange, and carried it back to the main room. He set it on the floor and knelt before it, his breath catching in his throat. This was the one place where his past was allowed to exist. The box of ghosts. For 6 years he had kept it shut, a sealed tomb of a life he could no longer bear to look at. Tonight, something had broken open inside him. He unlatched the lid. The first thing that hit him was the scent. It was the faint, lingering perfume of his wife, Lena, a ghost of vanilla and wildflowers, mingled with the dry, papery smell of old photographs. It was the smell of happiness, and it was an agony to breathe. His hands, which had stayed steady through firefights and medical emergencies, trembled as he reached inside. He pulled out a small stack of photographs. The first one was of Lena, taken on their last anniversary. She had vibrant, intelligent brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and long dark hair that she was constantly pushing out of her face. In the photo, she was laughing, her head thrown back, a picture of pure, unguarded joy. She was the architect of his world, the one who had taught his soldier's heart how to be soft, how to love. The next photo was of their daughter Maya, at 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his serious expression, a funny combination that made her look like a tiny, solemn judge. In the picture, she was holding a dandelion, its white, fluffy head ready to be scattered by the wind. She was his reason, the quiet center of his universe. He stared at their faces, these frozen moments of a perfect, ordinary life. He traced the outline of Lena's smile, the curve of Maya's cheek. The pressure in his chest grew, a physical, crushing weight of all the things he could no longer say, all the moments that had been stolen from them. But the tears would not come. His grief was a frozen ocean, too deep and too cold to thaw. Beneath the photos was a postcard. The image was of a rustic, hand-built log cabin, nestled amongst towering pine trees on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was a wild, beautiful, and lonely place. He flipped it over, Lena's elegant handwriting filled the back. "Our place," it read. "The perfect escape. Waiting for you to come home for good. All my love, L." He remembered the day she had given it to him, just before his final deployment. The cabin had belonged to her grandparents. It was their sanctuary, a place of peace and quiet on the coast of Washington state. She had inherited it, and they had made a promise. When he came home, for good this time, they would pack up their lives, take Maya and the dog they planned to get, and start over there. They would raise their daughter with the sound of the ocean and the smell of the pines. It was their future. A promise of a life beyond the military. A life of peace. He had come home, but he had come home to ashes. An out-of-control truck on a rain-slicked highway had taken everything. He had been left with nothing but ghosts and an unfulfilled promise. Tucked beside the postcard was a single old-fashioned brass key. The key to the cabin. The key to a future that never happened. He held the key in his palm, its metal cool against his skin. He looked from the smiling faces in the photographs to the old, tired dog sleeping on the floor. Ghost let out a soft sigh in his sleep, his legs twitching as he chased something in a dream. The two timelines in Elias's mind, the stolen past and the rapidly disappearing future, suddenly converged. A new thought, clear and sharp as a rifle shot, cut through the fog of his grief. He couldn't keep his promise to Lena and Maya. He couldn't turn back time. He couldn't save them. But Ghost was here. He was real, and he was running out of time. This would not be a retreat. It would not be an escape from the ghosts that haunted him. It would be a mission, a final, sacred duty. He would take Ghost to the place of the unfulfilled promise. He would give his last companion the peace and beauty of that wild coast. He would see to it that one of them, at least, would make it to their sanctuary. The decision settled over him, not with peace, but with a grim, galvanizing resolve. It was the first sense of purpose he had felt in 6 years. He moved with a new swiftness, going to the small desk where his laptop sat. He powered it on, the sudden blue light illuminating his face, revealing a mask of fierce determination. He logged into his bank account. The number displayed on the screen was pathetically small, the last of his savings, carefully guarded for an emergency he never thought would come. This was it. Without hesitation, he transferred the entire balance to his checking account. The screen asked him to confirm. He clicked the button. The money moved, the action as final and irreversible as a pulled trigger. He now had just enough cash for a few months of gas and simple supplies. After that, there was nothing. He closed the laptop and looked at the sleeping dog. The ghosts of his wife and daughter were still there, their presence a constant ache in his soul. But now, they were not just a source of pain. They were witnesses to a new promise, one he was determined to keep. The decision, once made, settled into Elias's bones and set him in motion. Sleep was a forgotten country. He moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the apartment with the quiet, methodical purpose of a soldier preparing for an operation. The listless, mechanical rituals of the past 6 years were gone, replaced by a focused, urgent energy. He was a man with a mission again. He started by packing a single olive-drab duffel bag for himself. The contents were sparse. A few changes of clothes, a simple first aid kit, a worn map of the Pacific Northwest. It was the kind of bag he had packed 100 times before, a testament to a life that could be contained in a canvas sack. Ghost watched him from his spot on the floor, his head raised, his amber eyes tracking every movement. The old dog was preternaturally attuned to his handler's moods. He sensed the shift from stagnant despair to focused intent. A low, almost imperceptible thump of his tail against the wood floor signaled his approval. Next, Elias turned his attention to Ghost's supplies. He gathered the bags of prescription food, the bottles of pain medication Dr. Miller had prescribed, the dog's worn leather collar, and his water bowl. As he packed, his hands moved over the familiar objects, each one a relic of their shared history. He paused as his fingers brushed against a folded, heavy-duty nylon vest at the bottom of the gear closet. He pulled it out. It was Ghost's old service harness. The material was faded from the relentless Afghan sun, and a small patch near the shoulder was frayed from where it had been grazed by shrapnel during an ambush outside of Kandahar. It was a piece of equipment, an instrument of war, designed for carrying medical supplies or detecting explosives. It represented a life of unwavering discipline, of rigid control, of service in the harshest conditions imaginable. Elias held the vest in his hands, the weight of it a familiar burden. He thought of the thousands of hours of training, the strict commands, the instant obedience required of a military working dog. Ghost had never been just a pet. He had been an asset, a partner, a soldier. He had faced gunfire and explosions. He had saved lives, including Elias's, more than once. But he had never chased a squirrel just for the fun of it. He had never been allowed to dig a hole on a beach. He had never known the simple, uncomplicated joy of being just a dog. A profound, aching sadness washed over Elias, so sharp and clear it almost stole his breath. He had been so consumed by his own grief, by the ghosts of his human family, that he had overlooked the quiet sacrifices of the living, breathing hero at his feet. He had a duty to Lena and Maya that he could never fulfill, but he had a duty to Ghost that he still could. Carefully, he folded the service vest and placed it at the bottom of the duffel bag, burying it under his own clothes. It was part of their past, but it would not be a part of their future. He walked to the small table in the main room, pulled out the single wooden chair, and sat down. From his go-bag, he retrieved a small, waterproof notebook and a pen. The first blank page stared up at him. For a man who had spent years planning complex missions, this felt both impossibly simple and monumentally important. This was not a plan for survival. It was a plan for living. He wasn't writing it for himself. He was writing it for Ghost. He uncapped the pen. The first item came to him easily. A memory of the bland, high-protein kibble that had fueled Ghost for his entire working life. Food as fuel, nothing more. He wrote, "Eat a real steak dinner." He pictured it clearly. A thick, juicy steak, seared on a cast-iron skillet. The kind of meal a hero deserved after a long tour. It would be a feast, a celebration of a life well lived. Next, he thought of the cold, hard floors, the designated sleeping mats, the rigid discipline that forbade a working dog from ever getting on the furniture. It was about readiness, about maintaining the line between handler and asset. He wrote down the second item, a small act of rebellion against their shared past. Sleep on the human bed. This was about more than just comfort. It was about intimacy, about breaking down the last barrier of their professional relationship. It was about letting Ghost know in no uncertain terms that he was family. His mind then drifted to the image of the leash, the constant physical link that represented control, command, and safety. A working dog was always on a lead, always an extension of its handler's will. The wild, windswept beach on the postcard from Lena's box appeared in his mind's eye. He imagined the joy of pure, untethered freedom. Walk on the beach with no leash. He wanted to see Ghost run, not because he was ordered to, but because the scent of the salt and the sea called to him. He wanted to see him explore the world on his own terms, driven by instinct and curiosity, not by a command. He paused, thinking of all the sunrises he had witnessed in his life. So many of them had been greeted with a knot of dread in his stomach, the pale light signaling the start of another dangerous patrol, another day of high alert. He wanted to reclaim that moment, to strip it of its old associations with fear, and replace it with something peaceful. Watch the sun rise together. It would not be about scanning the horizon for threats. It would be about simply being present, about sharing a moment of quiet, natural beauty, a silent acknowledgement of the start of one of Ghost's few remaining days. He looked at the 4 items on the list. They were good. They were meaningful. But there was something missing. He thought back to Maya, to her effortless, bubbling joy over the smallest things. He remembered taking her to a pet store once, and her delighted laughter at the sound of a squeaky toy. A military dog, trained for the grim realities of combat, had no concept of such a frivolous thing. A squeaky toy was a distraction, a useless noise. It was the antithesis of everything Ghost had been trained to be. It was the pure, silly, undiluted essence of a puppyhood that Ghost had never been allowed to have. With a strange, tender ache in his chest, Elias added the final item to the list, the one that felt the most important of all: have a squeaky toy. He put the pen down and looked at the completed list. It was short. It was simple, but it felt more significant than any mission directive he had ever written. It was a blueprint for grace. It was a promise. He closed the notebook and slid it into the breast pocket of his jacket. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the edges of the city skyline. His mission was set. Their journey was about to begin. The departure from the city was as quiet and unceremonious as the life Elias was leaving behind. He locked the apartment door for the last time without a backward glance. The long drive north was a blur of concrete and steel, slowly giving way to rolling hills and then the deep, formidable green of the Pacific Northwest. Elias drove with a focused stillness, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, a calm and dignified co-pilot, his head resting on the center console, occasionally looking up at Elias with an expression of complete trust. After hours on the highway, Elias turned onto a series of smaller, winding roads, each one taking them deeper into the wilderness. The air began to change, losing the city's dull, exhaust-tinged haze and taking on the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth. Finally, he turned onto a narrow, unpaved gravel road that seemed to climb directly into the clouds. The trees grew thicker here, ancient Douglas firs and Sitka spruces that formed a dense canopy overhead. The road ended abruptly in a small clearing on a high bluff. And there it was, the cabin from the postcard. It was exactly as Lena had described it, a sturdy, hand-built structure of dark, weathered logs with a prominent stone chimney. It looked both resilient and profoundly lonely, as if it had been waiting patiently for years. It stood as a silent sentinel, surrounded by towering pines, overlooking the vast gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean below. Elias cut the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there. The only sound, the ticking of the cooling engine, and the distant rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the rocks at the base of the bluff. This was the place, the sanctuary, the ghost of a future that had never been. He opened his door, and the air hit him with the force of a memory. It was cool and heavy with the smell of salt and wet stone. The sound of the ocean was immense, a constant, powerful whisper that seemed to fill the entire world. Ghost whined softly, eager to get out. Elias let him down, and the old dog immediately began to explore, his nose to the ground, his tail giving a few slow, inquisitive wags. The inside of the cabin was just as Elias had imagined. It was one large room with a sleeping loft above. A fine layer of dust covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood, cold ashes, and disuse. But it was solid. The bones of the place were good. Elias walked across the room and pushed open the heavy wooden shutters on the large window that faced the sea. light and fresh, salty air flooded the space, chasing the stale shadows into the corners. It felt like taking a first deep breath after being underwater for a very long time. He brought their gear inside, but didn't bother unpacking his own duffel. There was only one priority. He had a mission to execute, and it started now. From the small rustic kitchen, he retrieved an old, heavy cast-iron skillet. From his cooler, he took out a thick, beautifully marbled ribeye steak he had purchased at a small-town butcher shop on the way. The process was a ritual. He seasoned the steak simply with salt and pepper. He found a small canister of cooking oil in one of the cupboards and heated the skillet on the old gas stove until it was shimmering. The loud, satisfying sizzle when the steak hit the hot pan was the first real sound to fill the cabin since their arrival. A rich, savory aroma began to billow through the room, a smell of life and nourishment in a place that had been dormant for too long. Ghost, who had been lying near the door, lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. He rose slowly to his feet and padded over to the kitchen, his limp more pronounced after the long car ride. He sat a respectful distance away, his gaze locked on the skillet, a low, hopeful whine vibrating deep in his chest. When the steak was perfectly cooked, Elias let it rest on a cutting board. He sliced it into thick, bite-sized strips, the pink, juicy center a stark contrast to the dark, seared crust. He arranged the pieces in Ghost's bowl, a portion fit for a king. He set the bowl on the floor. For a moment, Ghost just stared at the offering, as if he couldn't comprehend it. His entire life had been a diet of scientifically formulated high-performance kibble. This was something else entirely. He looked up at Elias, a question in his eyes. "Go on, boy," Elias said, his voice rough. "It's yours." That was all the permission he needed. Ghost lowered his head and took a tentative bite, then another. A moment later, he was eating with a quiet, focused intensity, a pure, unrestrained delight that Elias hadn't seen in him for years. He ate until the bowl was spotlessly clean, then looked up at Elias, his muzzle slick, his eyes bright with a simple, profound gratitude. And as he watched, something inside Elias, something that had been frozen solid for 2,192 days, began to thaw. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not a breaking of the dam. It was just a flicker. A tiny, warm current that moved through the ice. For the first time in 6 years, the weary emptiness in his stormy gray eyes was replaced by a faint, shimmering glimmer of genuine feeling. He was not just observing his dog, he was sharing his joy. As night fell, a deep coastal chill seeped into the cabin. Elias built a fire in the stone hearth, the crackle and pop of the flames a comforting, primal sound. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls, making the room feel like a warm, living sanctuary against the vast, dark wilderness outside. When it was time to sleep, Ghost, following a lifetime of ingrained discipline, circled a spot on the braided rug before the fire and lay down with a contented groan. Elias watched him for a moment, then looked over at the simple wooden bed frame in the corner of the room. He walked over to it, the mattress old but thick, and patted the wool blanket that covered it. "Ghost," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Up." The old dog lifted his head, his ears perked. He looked from Elias to the bed, his expression one of utter confusion. This was a command he had never heard, a violation of a rule that had been absolute for his entire life. He gave a soft, questioning whine. Elias walked over and knelt beside him. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. He slid his arms under the dog's heavy body, one around his chest, the other under his hindquarters, and lifted. Ghost was a dead weight, but Elias carried him the few feet to the bed and gently laid him down on the blanket. Ghost was still for a moment, his body tense with uncertainty. Then, slowly, he relaxed. He stretched out, his old bones sinking into the softness of the mattress. He let out a long, deep sigh, a sound of such pure, unadulterated comfort that it seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He nudged his head against Elias's side and rested it there. Elias lay down beside him, fully clothed, and pulled another blanket over them both. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark, raftered ceiling. He did not sleep. He stayed awake for hours, listening. He listened to the fire crackling as it slowly died down to glowing embers. He listened to the constant rhythmic crash of the waves on the shore below, a sound like the steady breathing of the world. And he listened to the most important sound of all, the deep, slow, peaceful breathing of his friend, warm and solid and alive beside him. The next morning, Elias woke not to an alarm, but to the gentle weight of Ghost's head resting on his chest, and the sound of the ocean. The old dog looked up at him with clear, bright eyes, a silent invitation to start the day. The simple act of waking with another living, breathing creature beside him, rather than in the solitary silence he had become accustomed to, was a small, profound shift. He still felt the ache of grief, a dull throb beneath his ribs, but it was no longer the suffocating emptiness. Something new had joined it, a quiet sense of purpose, a fragile thread of connection. He brewed a strong pot of coffee on the old stove and shared a simple breakfast with Ghost. Dry toast for him, a small portion of kibble mixed with the leftover steak juice for the dog. The morning light streamed through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and highlighting the rustic beauty of the wooden beams. It was a peaceful beginning, a stark contrast to the urgency that had driven him from the city. After breakfast, Elias took out the small, waterproof notebook from his jacket pocket. He glanced at the list. 2 items down, 3 to go. The next one was simple, yet monumental for a dog like Ghost. Walk on the beach with no leash. He knew the path down to the beach. It was a steep, winding trail through the dense pine forest, slippery with damp needles and moss-covered roots. For a 12-year-old German shepherd with a bad hip, it would be a challenge. "Ready, boy?" Elias murmured, clipping Ghost's leash onto his collar, knowing he would remove it soon. He put his hand on Ghost's back, feeling the warmth of his fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The old dog looked up at him, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. The descent was slow. Elias moved carefully, bracing Ghost on the steeper sections, guiding him over exposed roots. Ghost, despite his age and infirmity, moved with a surprising tenacity, his nose constantly working, taking in the myriad scents of the forest. The air grew cooler, carrying a stronger scent of salt as they neared the bottom. Finally, the trees thinned, and they stepped out onto the wide, expansive stretch of beach. It was a wild, untamed place. The sand was dark and coarse, littered with driftwood, bleached white by the sun and smoothed by the tides. Jagged, black rocks jutted out from the surf, adorned with mussels and barnacles. The waves rolled in from the vast Pacific, crashing with an elemental power, sending spray high into the air. The wind, bracing and cold, tugged at Elias's clothes and ruffled Ghost's fur. Elias knelt beside Ghost, his hand on the old dog's collar. He hesitated for a moment, a lifetime of ingrained habits fighting against this simple act. Every fiber of his being, every instinct honed by years of military training, screamed that a working dog should never be off-leash in an unfamiliar, open environment. It was a breach of security, a loss of control, a potential risk. But this wasn't a mission. This was for Ghost. With a deep breath, he unclipped the leash. The small click echoed loudly in the vastness of the beach. For a moment, Ghost stood still, his body tense, unsure how to process this sudden, unprecedented freedom. He looked up at Elias, then out at the endless expanse of sand and sea. his ears twitching, his nose working overtime. It was as if a lifetime of rigid instruction had suddenly been lifted, and he didn't quite know what to do with the unexpected lightness. Then, a sudden, powerful gust of wind carried the scent of the ocean directly to him, a complex tapestry of brine, kelp, and 1,000 unseen creatures. Something primal sparked in Ghost's amber eyes. He took a hesitant step, then another. And then, as if an invisible thread had finally broken, he started to move. He didn't run at full speed, his old legs wouldn't allow it, but it was a joyous, unhindered trot. He moved with a purpose, a German shepherd unleashed, his tail held high, a blur of sable against the pale sand. He followed his nose, weaving between pieces of driftwood, pausing to sniff at a pile of seaweed, his body loose and free in a way Elias had rarely seen. He approached the water's edge, letting the cold, white foam lick at his paws, then pulled back with a playful shake of his head. He looked back at Elias, a triumphant, almost mischievous glint in his eyes, as if to say, "Look at me, I'm free." Elias just stood there, watching. He felt the cold wind on his face, heard the roar of the waves, smelled the salt. He saw Ghost, a proud and noble creature, finally experiencing the unadulterated joy of simple existence. And then, without warning, a memory slammed into him, vivid and sharp as a shard of glass. It wasn't a painful memory at first, just an image. He saw a different beach, a sun-drenched day, not on the wild Pacific, but on the gentle, warmer waters of the Outer Banks, during a rare leave period in the summer of 2013. Lena was there, her hair blowing in the breeze, holding Maya's tiny hand. Maya, then just 2 years old, was wearing a bright yellow swimsuit, her small body wobbling as she chased after a flock of gulls, her arms outstretched, her infectious laughter carried on the wind. He remembered the feeling of the warm sand between his toes, the taste of salt on his lips, the simple, profound contentment of being utterly present with his family. He saw Lena turn, her smile radiant, and call out, "Elias! Look at her, she's so happy." And he had looked. He had watched his daughter, a tiny spark of pure joy, utterly captivated by the simple wonder of the world. He had felt his heart swell, a sensation so overwhelming it almost hurt. The memory lingered, then fractured. The laughter faded, replaced by the screech of tires, the rending sound of twisted metal, the chilling silence that followed. The image of the gulls scattering transformed into the chaotic, horrific scene of the accident he had only ever seen in his nightmares, the one that had stolen his family in the autumn of 2019. The sand beneath his feet suddenly felt cold, the wind bit at his skin, and the joyous sound of the waves turned into a mournful wail. But this time, it was different. This time, as the pain washed over him, raw and visceral, it didn't consume him. It didn't send him retreating into the numb, hollow place he usually inhabited. He felt it, every agonizing bit of it. The crushing weight of loss, the gut-wrenching unfairness, the burning, desperate longing for a past that could never be reclaimed. He felt the phantom pain of Maya's small hand in his, the echo of Lena's laughter, but he also felt the cold wind, the hard sand, the thrum of the living world around him. And he saw Ghost. The old dog, having completed his joyful sprint, was now returning, his gait still favoring his bad hip, but his head high, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He nudged Elias's hand, a silent request for affirmation. Elias knelt, wrapping his arms around Ghost's thick neck, burying his face in the warm fur. The tears still didn't come. The dam was too strong for that. But the ice around his heart had cracked. The memory of his daughter's laughter, though tinged with an unbearable sorrow, was no longer a void. It was a wound that had finally begun to bleed. It was agonizing, but it was real, and in that raw, exposed pain, he felt a flicker of something new, something that had been dormant for too long. He felt alive. The days at the cabin began to settle into a quiet, gentle rhythm, dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the turning of the tides and the needs of an old dog. A week passed, then another. The thick layer of dust in the cabin was replaced by the clean scent of wood smoke and sea air. Elias had cleared the hearth, stacked firewood on the porch, and made the small space feel less like a forgotten relic and more like a sanctuary. The profound, oppressive silence of his city apartment was gone, replaced by the constant, soothing whispers of the ocean and the soft sounds of Ghost's presence. The click of his nails on the floor, his contented sighs as he slept by the fire. Their new routine was simple. It began before dawn, with the fourth item on Elias's list. Each morning, just as the first pale gray light began to separate the sea from the sky, Elias would gently lift Ghost, who was now too stiff to manage the porch steps on his own. He'd carry the old dog, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, out to one of the two weathered chairs on the porch. There they would sit, side by side, and watch the world be born anew. Elias would sip his coffee, the steam fogging in the cold air, and watch as the horizon bled from inky purple to soft rose, then to a brilliant fiery orange. He had seen countless sunrises in his life, but they had always been a prelude to a mission, a signal to be on high alert. Here, they were just beautiful. They were a quiet promise that another day had been granted. During these still, sacred moments, the first cracks in his long-held silence appeared. They were not words, not yet, but soft, guttural sounds. A low murmur of appreciation. "Look at that, boy," as a particularly vibrant splash of color painted the clouds. Or a quiet, comforting, "Easy now," as he adjusted the blanket around Ghost's aging frame. They were small sounds, almost involuntary, the first stirrings of a voice that had forgotten how to speak of anything but pain. After one such sunrise, Elias decided it was time for the final item on the list, the one that felt both the most frivolous and the most vital. He drove his old truck into the small coastal town a few miles down the road. It was a sleepy place, with a single main street lined with salt-sprayed storefronts, a diner, and a small grocery. The air smelled of low tide and diesel from the fishing boats in the harbor. Elias felt like a foreigner, his disciplined, military bearing at odds with the town's relaxed, unhurried pace. He kept his gaze down, avoiding eye contact, a ghost moving through a world of the living. He found what he was looking for in the back of the town's general store, a small pet aisle with a meager selection of collars, food, and toys. And there, in a dusty bin, was a bright yellow rubber duck. It had wide, painted-on blue eyes and a cheerful, almost idiotic expression. It looked absurdly out of place in Elias's large, calloused hand. He stood there for a long moment, the ridiculous toy feeling heavier than it should, a symbol of a normal life he knew nothing about. The simple act of buying a dog toy felt more alien to him than navigating a hostile desert at night. But he paid the cashier, took the small paper bag, and walked back to his truck, his mission accomplished. Back at the cabin, he presented the duck to Ghost. The old dog, who was dozing in a patch of sunlight on the porch, lifted his head and sniffed at the strange, bright object with cautious curiosity. He looked up at Elias, his expression one of polite confusion. This thing served no purpose. It was not food. It was not a command. What was he supposed to do with it? Elias knelt and gave the duck a firm squeeze. A loud, comical squeak pierced the quiet afternoon air. The sound was so unexpected that it startled them both. Ghost's ears shot up, and his head cocked to one side in a perfect canine expression of bewilderment. Elias squeezed it again. Squeak, This time, a flicker of something playful sparked in Ghost's eyes. He nudged the duck with his nose, then tentatively pawed at it. When it squeaked under his paw, he jumped back, then leaned in again, a low, rumbling growl of playful challenge forming in his chest. Finally, he gently picked it up in his mouth, his grip soft, and trotted a few feet away. The yellow duck held proudly, a prize he hadn't known he wanted. In the days that followed, the squeaky duck became a source of quiet amusement. Ghost never played with it aggressively, but he would carry it from the porch to the fireside, often falling asleep with his head resting on its bright yellow form. The ridiculous, cheerful squeak became a new part of the cabin's soundscape, a small, recurring note of joy in their peaceful sanctuary. It was this newfound peace, this gentle rhythm of sunrises and squeaky toys, that finally unlocked the words inside Elias. The dam broke not in a flood, but in a slow, steady trickle. It started one evening as they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, hypnotic glow. Elias was staring into the embers, the yellow duck resting by Ghost's paws. "You know," Elias began, his voice raspy from disuse. He cleared his throat. "That duck, it's stupid." He paused, as if surprised by the sound of his own words forming a complete thought. Ghost's ear twitched in his direction. He was listening. "Maya would have loved it," Elias continued, the name a physical weight on his tongue. "My daughter. She would have laughed so hard at that sound." And just like that, the stories began. He told Ghost about Maya, about her solemn-eyed curiosity, and her sudden bursts of brilliant laughter. He spoke of Lena, of her strength and her kindness, of the way she could make him feel safe in a way no armor ever could. He found that Ghost was the perfect confidant. The old dog simply listened, his steady, non-judgmental presence creating a space safe enough for the ugliest truths. The trickle of words became a steady flow. He talked about his team, about the bone-deep brotherhood forged in the dust and chaos of combat. He spoke of his friend, Sergeant Davies, Ghost's first handler, a man with a booming laugh who had died in Elias's arms after an IED strike. One night, with the wind howling outside and the sea roaring below, Elias finally gave voice to the deepest, most poisoned wound of all. "It was my fault," he whispered into the crackling silence of the fire. "I should have been there. I had a choice, one more tour or come home. I chose the tour. I thought it was my duty. I thought I was protecting them by being over there." He finally looked at Ghost, his eyes shimmering with a pain that was 6 years old and as fresh as the morning's tide. "But the danger wasn't there, boy. It was here, on a wet road, and I wasn't there to stop it. I was a world away, saving strangers, while my own family, while they—" His voice broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He had never spoken these words aloud. He had never allowed himself to even fully form the thought. He had let the guilt fester in the dark, a poison that had turned his heart to stone. Ghost stirred from his spot. He rose stiffly and limped over to Elias, pushing his great warm head under the man's trembling hands, whining softly. It was a gesture of pure, unconditional comfort. Elias wrapped his arms around the dog, clinging to him like a drowning man, and finally let the storm of his grief break. The sea and the fire and the old dog were his only witnesses. The emotional storm that had broken over Elias by the fireside left a strange calm in its wake. The confession of his deepest guilt, spoken aloud for the first time, did not magically heal him, but it lanced a wound that had been festering for 6 long years. In the days that followed, the crushing weight on his chest felt lighter. He still moved through a world colored by grief, but he was no longer drowning in it. He was present. He noticed the changing tides, The way the light filtered through the tall pines in the late afternoon, and the increasing slowness in Ghost's steps. Their peaceful isolation was sustainable for only so long. A week after his breakdown, their supplies began to run low. Coffee, bread, and most importantly, the prescription dog food that was easiest on Ghost's sensitive stomach were nearly gone. The necessity of a trip into town loomed, a prospect that brought a familiar knot of anxiety to Elias's stomach. The cabin had become a sanctuary, a safe cocoon where he could exist with his memories and his dog, without the prying eyes of the world. To leave it was to re-enter a world of strangers, a world he had long since abandoned. But Ghost's needs were paramount. His mission demanded it. He helped the old dog into the truck and made the familiar drive into the small coastal town. He parked on the main street, the salty air thick with the smell of frying fish from the local diner. He felt the casual glances of the locals, the natural curiosity of a small community, noticing a stranger in their midst. He pulled his worn beanie down a little lower and focused on his task, his shoulders set in a defensive posture. The town's general store was a place that seemed to exist outside of time. A small bell chimed as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was a comforting mix of freshly ground coffee, sawdust, and old paper. The worn floorboards creaked under his boots. The shelves were packed with a dizzying array of goods, from fishing tackle and rain gear to canned goods and fresh produce. It was the heart of the town, a place for commerce, but also for connection. Behind the counter was the proprietor, a woman the town knew as Clara. She was a woman in her late 60s, with a full head of silver hair pulled back in a neat, practical bun. Her face was a roadmap of a life lived by the sea, with fine lines etched around her kind, observant eyes. Her hands, resting on the worn wooden counter, were gnarled with arthritis, but looked strong and capable. She had a calm, steady presence, the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all. Over the past few weeks, they had developed a silent routine. Elias would come in once a week, his list on a small scrap of paper. He would move through the store with quiet efficiency, gathering only what he needed. His interactions with Clara were minimal, dictated by necessity. "Just this today," he would say, his voice low and raspy. "That'll be $28.50, she would reply, her tone even and professional. He always paid in cash, avoiding the small talk that came with running a credit card. But while their verbal exchanges were sparse, nothing escaped Clara's notice. She saw the deep, settled sadness in the stranger's eyes. She saw the way his list always included the most expensive, highest quality dog food the store carried. She saw that he bought nothing for himself beyond the barest necessities. And she saw, in his rare moments of distraction, that his gaze would often drift out the window, as if he were looking for someone who wasn't there. Today, as Elias placed his items on the counter, coffee, bread, a bag of rice, and the large sack of dog food, Clara held up a hand. "One moment," she said, her voice soft. She turned and reached under the counter, retrieving a small butcher paper-wrapped bundle tied with string. She placed it beside his other groceries. "This is for your friend," she said simply. Elias stared at the package, then at her, his expression guarded and confused. "I didn't order this." "It's not an order," she replied, her eyes kind. "It's a soup bone. From the butcher. A good one. For your friend." He was taken aback. This simple, unprompted act of kindness was so foreign to his isolated world that he didn't know how to react. His first instinct was to refuse, to reject the connection, to retreat back into his shell. "I can pay for it," he said, his voice stiff as he reached for his wallet. Clara shook her head gently. "No, it's a gift." As she spoke, her gaze instinctively flickered for a fraction of a second, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift to a spot on the cluttered corkboard on the wall behind her. Elias's eyes followed hers. Tacked among town notices and old receipts was a small square photograph, its colors faded by decades of sunlight. The edges were curled, and the surface was glossy and cracked. In the photo, a much younger Clara, her hair dark and her smile wide and unburdened, knelt in a field of wildflowers. Her arms were wrapped around the neck of a magnificent, happy-looking golden retriever. The dog's tongue was lolling out in a goofy grin, its golden fur shining, its eyes full of the boundless, unconditional love that only a dog can give. It was a perfect moment of pure joy, captured and preserved from a time long past. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken understanding. Clara's gaze returned to Elias, and in her eyes, he saw it all. He saw that her gesture was not one of pity, but of empathy. It was a quiet acknowledgement from one soul to another, a recognition of the profound, life-altering bond a person can have with an animal. She didn't need to know his story. She didn't need to know about Ghost's diagnosis or the mission that had brought him here. She just knew. She knew the joy, and she knew the inevitable, heart-shattering pain that came with it. She was a member of the same tribe. The defensive walls around Elias's heart, the ones he had so carefully constructed over 6 years, did not crumble. But a small gate, one he didn't even know existed, creaked open. He was not just a grieving stranger in this town. He was seen. He stopped fumbling with his wallet. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he let her see past the stoic, empty facade. He let her see the flicker of the man underneath, the man who was tired and sad, and deeply, deeply grateful. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but his voice was different. It was not the clipped, mechanical tone he usually used. It was warm, and it was sincere. Clara simply nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. The transaction was complete. Elias left the store, the small bell chiming his departure. He walked back to his truck, the bag of groceries in one hand, the butcher paper-wrapped bone in the other. The small act of kindness felt momentous, an anchor of human connection in his vast ocean of grief. He had come to this town seeking only supplies, but he had found something far more valuable, a silent neighbor. The third week arrived with the turning of the tide, and it brought with it a palpable change. The fragile peace of their routine was now shadowed by an undeniable urgency. The list was complete, the small joys all ticked off, and now only the quiet, somber act of waiting remained. Ghost's decline, which had been a slow, steady descent, now steepened into a fall. The bursts of energy that had carried him across the sandy beach were gone. His appetite, which had been so robust for Clara's soup bones and Elias's cooking, now waned. He would often just sniff at his food before turning his head away, a weary disinterest in his eyes. He slept for most of the day, his dreams filled with twitching paws and soft whimpers, and when he was awake, he had trouble getting to his feet. The strength in his hind legs, once powerful enough to clear any obstacle, had all but vanished. Elias's days became a vigil. His world shrank to the confines of the cabin and the needs of his friend. He became a nurse, his movements gentle and deliberate. He would help Ghost stand, his strong hand supporting the dog's frail hips. He would carry him out to the porch and back, his own muscles straining under the weight of his friend. He would coax him to eat, offering warm broth from a spoon, his voice a low, constant murmur of encouragement. The man who had been frozen by grief was now fully immersed in the act of caring. There was no room for numbness. Every moment was sharp, precious, and tinged with the metallic taste of impending loss. He watched the subtle changes in Ghost's breathing, the way the light in his eyes would sometimes dim, and each observation was a small cut to his own heart. One afternoon, the relentless coastal wind died down, and the world outside the cabin fell into a profound stillness. The sun, low in the sky, cast long golden shafts of light through the pines. Ghost, who had been sleeping deeply, stirred. He lifted his head and looked towards the back of the cabin, towards the dense, dark forest that bordered the property. A low whine escaped his throat. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of longing. Elias understood. It was a call to the wild, a final echo of the working dog who had spent his life navigating difficult terrain. The forest was the one place they hadn't explored together. "All right, boy," Elias whispered, his voice thick. "One last time. A final patrol." He helped Ghost to his feet. The old dog was unsteady, his body trembling with effort, but his eyes were clear, his spirit willing. They walked to the edge of the forest, where a faint trail, barely more than a deer path, wound its way under the heavy canopy of the ancient trees. The forest was like a cathedral. The air was cool and smelled of moss and rich, dark earth. A carpet of emerald green moss covered the ground, silencing their steps. The light that filtered through the high branches was soft and ethereal, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. It was a place of deep, reverent quiet. Ghost walked with a slow, deliberate dignity, his head held high, his nose twitching, reading the secret stories of the forest floor. He was no longer the powerful, tireless dog of his youth, but he was still a soldier. He was on patrol. Elias walked beside him, his hand hovering just above Ghost's back, a silent, protective presence. They moved slowly, covering only a few dozen yards before Ghost would have to stop, his breathing coming in ragged pants. They continued like this for what felt like a long time, venturing deeper into the tranquil woods. Elias let Ghost set the pace, his own senses on high alert, not for threats, but for any sign of his friend's distress. They were in a small clearing, where a massive, moss-covered fir tree had fallen long ago. When Ghost finally faltered, his hind legs simply gave out from under him. He didn't fall hard. He collapsed softly onto the bed of moss, his body surrendering to its own weakness. He tried to push himself up, his front legs scrabbling for purchase, but his back end would not obey. He let out a soft, frustrated sigh and lay his head down, looking up at Elias with eyes that were a heartbreaking mixture of apology and absolute trust. That was the moment the dam inside Elias finally broke. For weeks he had been focused on Ghost's joy. For years he had been numb to his own pain. But seeing this proud, indomitable creature, his partner, his warrior, reduced to this state of helpless surrender, was a sight he could not endure with his usual stoicism. It was the final, devastating blow to the armor around his heart. "It's okay," Elias choked out, the words catching in his throat. He knelt beside Ghost, his hand stroking the dog's graying head. "It's okay, boy. You did good. You did so good." He looked ahead, down the path that stretched deeper into the woods. He would not let their patrol end here. He would finish it for both of them. He slid his arms under Ghost's body, one securing his chest, the other supporting his heavy hindquarters. With a deep grunt of effort, he stood, lifting the full 100 pounds of his friend into his arms. Ghost let out a soft sigh and relaxed against his chest, his head resting in the crook of Elias's arm. Elias began to walk again, his steps slow and measured, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The only sounds in the cathedral of trees were his own ragged breaths, the thundering of his own heart, and the soft whisper of the wind in the high branches. He walked until he reached a small, sun-dappled clearing. He sat down on a large fallen log, carefully cradling Ghost in his lap. He looked down at the face of his friend. He saw the gray fur around his muzzle, the faint, jagged scar above his left eye from a training accident years ago. The way his eyes were now closed in weary contentment. He saw a lifetime of loyalty, courage, and unwavering companionship. He saw the last living link to his past, and he knew, with a certainty that was both a cold terror and a quiet grace, that this link was about to break. The first sob was a raw, ugly sound, torn from a place that had been silent for 6 years. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony. It was quickly followed by another, and then another. The tears he had been unable to shed, the tears he had frozen inside him on that rainy day in 2019, finally began to fall. They streamed down his weathered face, hot and cleansing, dripping from his chin onto Ghost's soft fur. He buried his face in Ghost's neck, and the full, unrestrained storm of his grief erupted. It was a violent, racking sorrow, the desperate, heartbroken wails of a man who had lost everything. He wept for the old dog in his arms, for the slow, inevitable dimming of a life so precious to him. He wept for the ghost of his daughter's laughter on a sunlit beach. He wept for the memory of his wife's warm smile. He wept for his fallen friend, Davies, who should have been the one to grow old with this dog. He wept for the man he had been, and for the hollow shell he had become. There in the profound, silent witness of the ancient forest, Elias Thorne, the soldier, the hero, the widower, the father, finally surrendered. He wept until there were no tears left, until all that remained was the shuddering echo of his own broken heart. Elias carried Ghost back from the forest as the sun began to set, his own body aching with a fatigue that went far beyond the physical. The violent storm of his grief had passed, leaving him hollowed out, raw, but strangely clear. He laid Ghost gently on the soft bed, the place that had become his friend's final sanctuary, and tended to him through the long, quiet night. He woke the next morning on the floor beside the bed, his neck stiff, one hand still resting on Ghost's flank. He had not meant to sleep, but exhaustion had claimed him. He sat up and looked at his friend, and in the cool gray light of dawn, he knew. It wasn't one single thing. It was a collection of subtle, heartbreaking signs. Ghost's breathing, which had been slow and deep, was now shallow and intermittent. He no longer responded to Elias's voice or touch. He had not taken water since the day before. But most of all, it was in his eyes. When they did flutter open, the intelligent, amber light was gone, replaced by a distant, hazy look. He was still there, but he was also already leaving. The fight was over. His body was tired, and his spirit was ready for peace. To ask him to hold on any longer would be an act of selfishness, not love. A profound, aching sadness settled over Elias. But it was a clean sadness, free of the frantic desperation of the day before. It was the quiet, solemn weight of acceptance. He knew what his final duty was. His hand was steady as he retrieved the small, worn business card from the mantelpiece. He walked out onto the porch, the cold morning air sharp against his tear-stained face, and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar, calm voice answered. "Dr. Miller?" "It's Elias Thorne," Elias said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "Ghost's handler." There was a pause on the other end, filled with an immediate understanding. "I see, Dr. Miller," Miller said, his voice gentle. "How is he?" "It's time," Elias said simply. The words were the hardest he had ever spoken, yet they came with a sense of profound rightness. "I understand," the vet replied. "I can be there late this afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Will that be all right?" "Yes," Elias said. "Thank you." He ended the call and stood for a long moment, looking out at the endless gray ocean. He had a final day, a handful of precious hours. He would not waste them on despair. He would fill them with gratitude. He spent the entire day by Ghost's side. He did not leave him for a moment. He carried the old dog, wrapped in his warmest blanket, out to the porch and sat him in the armchair so he could feel the sun on his fur and smell the salty air. Elias sat on the steps at his feet, one hand always touching him, a constant, reassuring presence. He did not speak much at first, but as the hours passed, he began to talk, his voice a low, steady murmur, a counterpoint to the rhythmic crash of the waves. He found Ghost's old grooming brush, a familiar tool with worn bristles, and began the slow, meditative process of brushing his thick coat. The repetitive motion was calming, an act of service, of care, of love. And as he brushed, he whispered his thanks. "Thank you for watching my six all those years," he murmured, his hands working gently through a tangle in the fur on Ghost's ruff. "I always knew you were there. Never had to look back. I always knew." He paused, his eyes unfocused, lost in a memory. "Remember that firefight in the valley, when Davies went down? You pulled me behind that rock. You stayed right there, snarling at anything that moved until the dust-off came. You saved my life that day, boy. You saved all of our lives." He moved the brush along Ghost's back, the sable fur still thick and beautiful. "Thank you for staying with me after I lost everything. In that empty apartment, when the silence was so loud it felt like screaming, you were there. You were the only thing that felt real. You were my reason to get out of bed in the morning, my only reason." His voice grew thick with emotion, but the tears did not come. This was something beyond tears. It was a deep, quiet accounting of a sacred debt. "Thank you for never judging me," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "for not caring that I was broken, for just being here." He put the brush down and simply stroked the dog's great, noble head. Ghost let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh, a faint puff of air against Elias's hand. "You brought me here," Elias said, looking out at the wild, beautiful coast. "You brought me back to Lena's promise. You broke my heart open, you stubborn old soldier. You made me feel again." He sat like that for hours as the sun made its slow arc across the sky. He told ghost stories about their old team, about the funny things Davies used to do, about the quiet moments of peace they had found even in the midst of war. He was giving his friend a final, gentle debrief, recounting a life of honor, courage, and unwavering loyalty. He was saying goodbye. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the sea, a profound sense of peace settled in Elias's soul. The raw, jagged edges of his grief had been smoothed away, leaving a deep and abiding love. He had found what he had been searching for, not in isolation, but in the act of giving. In this final, selfless act of mercy for his friend, he had found his own. This was not a defeat. It was not a surrender to the darkness. It was a release, an act of grace. It was peace. He gently lifted Ghost from the chair, holding him close, and carried him back inside, laying him on the bed before the fire. He lay down beside him, his arm draped over his friend's body, his head next to Ghost's. He felt the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He closed his eyes, memorizing the feel of the warm fur, the familiar scent of his dog, the quiet rhythm of his fading life. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, a sound from the outside world pierced the tranquility of the cabin. It was the low, crunching sound of tires on the gravel road. It was time. Dr. Miller had been kind, his actions filled with a quiet, respectful compassion that had eased the terrible finality of the moment. He had left Elias alone with his friend, and in the deep silence of the cabin, Elias had held Ghost until his last gentle breath had sighed out into the world, leaving behind a stillness that was absolute. He woke the next morning on the bed, the place where Ghost had spent his last night. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving a pile of cold gray ash. The cabin was filled with a silence so profound, so heavy, that it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. Every silence he had ever known, in the city apartment, in the lonely stretches of the desert, was a pale imitation of this. That silence had been an absence of noise. This was an absence of a soul. There was no soft thump of a tail to greet the morning, no click of nails on the wooden floor, no gentle, wet nose nudging his hand for breakfast. The emptiness was a tangible presence, a ghost of a different kind. With a slowness that felt ancient, Elias forced himself to move. He went through the motions of his morning ritual. But each step was a painful reminder. He scooped coffee for one. He filled a water bowl that would not be used. He stood at the window and looked out at a world that seemed cruelly indifferent, continuing its endless cycles of tide and light, as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Inside him, the numbness was gone, replaced by a clean, sharp, agonizing pain. He felt everything. He felt the cold of the floorboards under his bare feet. He felt the heat of the coffee mug in his hands. And he felt the crushing, monumental weight of his grief. A pain so real and so deep, it was a wonder it didn't stop his own heart from beating. But it didn't. He was still here. He was still feeling. He pulled on his jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and crisp, and the sky was just beginning to blush with the first hints of dawn. He sat down in his usual chair, leaving the one beside him achingly empty. He watched as the sun climbed over the horizon, painting the clouds in strokes of orange and gold, just as it had every morning they had been here. He watched it alone. The beauty of the moment was almost unbearable, a magnificent spectacle with no one to share it with. The pain was immense, but it was real. It was the pain of love. It was the proof that his heart was no longer made of stone. After the sun was fully in the sky, he went back inside. He felt a pull, a quiet instinct guiding him not to the solace of the sea or the forest, but back to the past. He knelt and opened the wooden memory box one more time. He looked at the photos of Lena and Maya, and for the first time, he was able to see their smiles without the immediate, crushing shadow of their loss. The ache was still there, but now it was mingled with a profound and tender love, a gratitude for the time he'd had, however short. His fingers brushed against a sealed envelope he had ignored for years. It was addressed to him in the familiar, slightly slanted handwriting of his younger sister, Sarah. The postmark was from late in the year 2019, a few weeks after the funeral he had forbidden her from attending, a desperate act of self-preservation to keep the world, and everyone in it, at bay. He remembered the day it had arrived, how he had looked at it as if it were a bomb, and had immediately buried it in the box, unopened. He had not been capable of receiving comfort then. He had not been capable of feeling anything. Now, he was. With steady hands, he carefully tore open the envelope. The single sheet of paper inside was covered in his sister's handwriting, the ink slightly blurred in places, as if from tears. "Elias," it began, "I know you said you needed space. I know you're in a place I can't possibly understand. I'm trying to respect that, but it's killing me. I don't know if you'll ever even read this. I just need to say it. I am so sorry. I miss them every single day. I can't imagine what you're going through. I miss Lena's laugh, and I miss the way Maya used to hide behind your legs whenever I came over. But Elias, I miss you too. You're my big brother. You were always the one who was supposed to protect us. Please don't disappear completely. Please don't let this break you. You are not alone in this, even if it feels that way. I am here. Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I will be here. I love you." Below the words, she had written her phone number and her new address. Elias read the letter once, then twice. The simple, heartfelt words were a bridge across a 6-year chasm of silence and pain. He had been so consumed by his own island of grief that he had forgotten that other people had loved them too, that he was not the only one left behind. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and rolled down his cheek, landing on the paper. It was not a tear of agonizing loss like the ones he had shed in the forest. It was a tear of regret, of sorrow for the years of connection he had rejected, and of a deep, aching love for the sister who had refused to give up on him. He folded the letter with reverent care and placed it on the table beside him. He looked around the quiet cabin. It had been his sanctuary, the place where he had come to honor a promise. He understood now that it was not a tomb where he was meant to fade away. It was a crucible, a place of transformation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The battery was low, but it had enough life. He unlocked the screen, his thumb hovering over the keypad. He carefully, deliberately, typed in the 10 digits from the bottom of his sister's letter. He saved the contact under the name Sarah. He stared at the name on the screen, his thumb resting near the green call icon. His heart hammered against his ribs. What would he say? Where would he even begin? The prospect was terrifying, a mountain far steeper than any he had ever climbed. He wasn't ready, not yet. But he was ready to try. He lowered the phone, not making the call, but not deleting the number. He left it there, a small beacon of possibility on the screen. He looked out the window at the vast, endless ocean, and he thought of the old soldier who had led him here. Ghost had not saved him from the enemy fire that had taken his friends. He had not saved him from the cruel twist of fate that had taken his family. He had done something far more difficult. He had stayed. He had waited. He had guided him through the darkness, not by pulling him, but by simply walking beside him, until Elias could finally find the strength to save himself. Ghost had not saved his life. He had saved his soul. And now, for the first time in a very long time, a new day was beginning. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is not saving a life, but saving a soul. Ghost's final mission was a quiet one, to guide his friend back from the darkness, not with force, but with unwavering loyalty. If their journey touched your heart, we invite you to support us by subscribing to our channel. We would be honored to read about a loyal companion who changed your life in the comments below. By sharing this story, you help us celebrate these incredible bonds. As this chapter closes, another one begins, and our newest tale is waiting for you now, right on the screen.